Hi, it's T with TeaQuilts, and today we're going to talk about quilt sleeves. And I do my quilt sleeves a little bit different than most. I like to sew my sleeves on permanently, and I like to have 99% of it done by machine, if possible. And we'll talk about that 1% at the end. But what I start with is my quilt, and I measure my border. And my border is 4 1/4. So I take the size of my border from the edge of the quilt to this seam line, and I double that. So that's 8 1/2, and then I add an inch. So what I need is a strip as long as my quilt top by 9 1/2. So I have a piece of fabric here. I just lay the fabric on the quilt top and cut the length the same size as my quilt. So I'm just going to take a pair of scissors, put a little snip down here, and then I know where to cut. So I'm going to remove the quilt temporarily. And then I'm going to square up these ends. So I have my slit right here. So I just line up on the edge here. Cut one side. And as you can see, I also use a lot of my scraps when I'm doing this project. Now that I've got it roughly cut to the length, I go ahead and fold this so that I can cut off my 9 1/2 inch width. And since it's a sleeve, I don't worry too much. I just go ahead and use my mat lines for this. So I need a piece that's 9 1/2 inches wide. Now for the next step, I'm going to go to my iron, and I'm going to press these seams over about 3/8 of an inch twice, and then I'm going to go to my sewing machine and stitch this part down, and I'll be back with that step. Okay, I'm back, and just for clarification, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, I am working with a completely quilted quilt top that does not have the binding on at this point. Okay, so I have my piece that I originally cut to the same width as my quilt, and then I folded under about 3/8 of an inch on both ends of the material, and then I've stitched those edges down. Now the next step is to turn the quilt over on the back side where we want to put the hanging sleeve, and I center it onto the quilt top, and you should end up with at least an inch on each side of your quilt. And then I pin, and I put the pins in so that the pins are sticking up, and I pinned about every 4 to 5 inches is good. It can be spaced a little bit more if you like. These pins are not set right now. They're going to actually come back out later. I'm just basically making sure that my sleeve is square with the top edge. Okay, so I have the entire sleeve pinned onto my quilt, right side facing my quilt back. Now what I want to do is I want to come down more than half, because I know my seam line is about here in the quilt. I want to come down below that. So I'm going to go about to this point. Along this entire length of this quilt, I'm going to put some pins to keep this sleeve flat. And I want to be below the line on my border on the front where I'm going to be stitching. And I want to keep this flat as possible. So I put in quite a few pins to keep this from moving around. But I want to make sure I'm below that seam line, because when we're stitching from the front, you will not be able to see these. You will not be able to see these pins. Now, this piece here is kind of flapping, and I don't want it to flop up in my way, so I just put 4 pins in it to hold. You don't have to pin this one very secure. You just don't want it to flop around. So for this size quilt, 4 pins is good. So I have everything pinned. I'm going to flip it back to the front side. Now I don't know if you can see in the camera, but this area here is where I have placed pins. I can see them popping up every now and then. So it's going approximately through this part of the quilt. I'm going to be stitching in the ditch through here. And I'm going to use either the same color thread that you stitched your quilt with, or you can use whatever fabric your border, whatever color thread that matches your border fabric closest. So I'm going to use light blue because that's what I kind of use for my stitching. And I'm going to go stitch from here all the way down to here along this border line. And then I'm going to come back and show you the next step. I've sewn in the ditch along this line here. And then I also backtracked at each end. And the reason why I didn't stitch all the way out is because this quilt has mitered corners. And if I had a quilt that had my top border put on last, I would go completely across from one end to the other. And I'm going to show you that on another quilt. So on this quilt here, my border went all the way across the quilt as compared to this quilt that had a mitered corner. So I stopped stitching here. On this quilt, I actually stitched from one long end all the way down to the edge. And then I have my sleeve there. So we're going to go back to this quilt. I'm going to flip it over so you can see the back. I haven't removed any pins because I wanted you to see how it would look coming off the machine. So this is the reason right here is why I try to smooth out and flatten as much as I can. And the more pins you have in here, the less of these waves you'll have. So this is still pretty good. I'm actually going to take that and it's going to be just fine. So what I want to do now is remove my pins on my lower half. I'm leaving the pins right now at the top edge. So I want to completely release the bottom portion of this sleeve. So now that the sleeve is loose, what you do is just bring the bottom ends up. And remember, because we were sewing with a miter end, this part of the sleeve did not get sewn down. And this is where part of that 1% I'm talking about will come into play. Now I just want to pull this up and then just take my pins that I have sticking out from the top and repin, getting both layers of my sleeve as well as my quilt top pinned. And I do this all the way down the quilt. And the reason why I like my pins sticking out is that I can see them when I'm stitching, and I can pull them out right before they hit the needle. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my iron. I'm going to pull this back, give a good press on this line, and then when I get that line pressed, this is going to want to come back into the position where that line is stitched, and I'm going to stitch it down, and I'm going to show you how flat this is going to be when I'm done. Back with the quilt top where I press the excess fabric down, and what you end up with is a flange. And when you actually put this on the rod, it will give you a little bit more room so that the quilt isn't pulling and tugging on the rod. It just gives this little extra fabric, makes a big difference when you're actually hanging the quilt. So now that I have this down, my next step is to go and stitch across the top to connect all three pieces together. And I'm just going to skip that step and go to one that I've already done. So here on this quilt, I have, this was originally like this, and then I stitched my piece down. You can see where I have two lines up here. One line was when I basted the sleeve to the top, and then the second line is when I added my binding. So then once you get your sleeve completely on, you can go ahead and put your binding on the front of your quilt, which is what I have done. Now when I'm hand sewing, the other part of the 1% of sewing that you have to do is right here. You have this sleeve up, and I find when we have Gale quilt shows that if I don't take my back part of my sleeve and stitch it down, they will put the rod through here, and I don't want the rod touching my quilt. I want the quilt inside. Go ahead and I hand baste this down when I'm actually sewing my binding down, and I will do that on both sides. So that's how you attach a sleeve, and you have very minimal sewing by hand. The only hand sewing I will have to do is these two side parts where I don't want the rod to touch the back of my quilt. On this quilt top, I will have just a little bit more hand sewing to do because of this being a mitered corner. I didn't want to stitch down my quilt there, so I will have to hand sew this little portion down when I get to hand sewing my binding, and then I'll also have to sew up here, but that's not a lot, and that's only when the quilts are mitered. And you could sew up your miter if you like. I just don't sew up my miter. But I hope you find this video helpful, and I'll see you in my next video.